What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Brad Watts, and you are listening to the Nutrition Hero Podcast. And thank you for participating. Thank you for being along on the journey with me here today. And as always, we're celebrating both the art and the science of functional medicine, clinical nutrition, and I get excited about where functional medicine is headed. And so today we'll talk a little bit about that. But the meat of today's podcast episode is going to be the mailbag. And so, mailbag episode today, meaning this: doctors from all around the country send questions to my email, and I'll answer them personally to them. But every now and then, I like to sit down and take a few of the most common questions, or what I think are the best questions, record a podcast episode, because if this person has a question, or if I have a question, there's got to be somebody else out there that has the same thought process or the same question in mind. So we're going to go through this. It's going to be good. I'm excited about it. Let's get to it. So, a couple of things. Doctor from Southern California says, Dr. Brad, let me just read this here for you. Dr. Brad, where in the world is functional medicine heading with this new administration? So I would imagine he's talking about the Trump administration and functional medicine. Are we going to be something that gets legislated out of the picture? Or are we going to be something that gets brought along? And I will say this. I think that, without getting political on you, I think that functional medicine as a whole with this administration is going to be a good thing. Functional medicine is going to be a growing industry, number one. The administration has clearly made it known that they are all about, absolutely all about competition. And so I don't think you're going to be seeing any legislated monopolies. I don't think you're going to see that. And competition in healthcare from a choice perspective is pretty cool too, because that's what functional medicine, that's like the meat of where we're going to end up having our business coming from. And so I think it's going to be a good thing. I think that overall you're going to see improvements in different choices that people have in healthcare. And I think that if you can position yourself within that marketplace, maybe not necessarily being a one-stop shop like I do everything, but picking and choosing what your niche is and being able to serve those patients faithfully with a little like pizzazz, like a little enthusiasm, I think that's going to go a long way. And I don't see that stopping. And it's not necessarily just because of the administration, but I think it's also because of the times that we're in, where people have access to information. It's basically free information out there to anybody. And it's not about knowing things, it's about assimilating things. And functional medicine providers do that better than anybody, I think, on the planet right now. So, anyhow, it's about the assimilation of the information. Information's free, but the synthesizing of it, or the assimilation of it, is where people run into trouble on their own. So you got a cold, what do? You go ask Dr. Google what's going on, and sometimes Dr. Google is mean. Sometimes Dr. Google will mess you up, and not to mention if you have gut issues or otherwise. So just something to think about there. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit, Doctor from Southern California. You know who you are. And that will be good. So anyway, keep an eye out. I think that functional medicine is going to flourish under not just this administration, but I think just this time period that we're in right now. So very good. All right, here is another question. Do you ever do genetic testing on your patients? You talk a lot about blood chemistry, but I don't hear much about genetic code. Yes, I do genetic testing on my patients, and let's talk about the advent of that a little bit. So we have this whole thing coming along like nutrigenomics, where how is food changing the expression of your genetic code as a patient? And there are obviously some rabbit trails that you can go down as a provider that may or may not be helpful to your patient base. And even from a patient management perspective, there are some things that I've found over the last couple of years, specifically with genetic testing, that you want to be aware of. So we'll talk about that. Actually, let's just start there. So patient management, when people hear the word genetics, for whatever reason, they think written in stone. Like it's like It is, they hear genetic and they think fate, right? Like, oh, I have no choice. It's genetic. I have no choice. That's not reality. You know that as a provider, it's not reality. It just means that that's the roadmap their body has. Doesn't mean they have to follow the roadmap necessarily, because you can, with the advent of nutrigenomics, really what we're discovering more and more about, I say we as healthcare in general, is the modification of the expression of the gene, excuse me. So we're talking about epigenetics more than we are about genetics. So the epigenetic switches, it's like, think of like a circuit board or a control panel in an operating room, like an old school telephone operating room, right? You've seen the people plugging in all this stuff. Hey, I want to talk to so-and-so on, this is their address. And so they plug it in. That's basically what is happening with epigenetics, is it's regulating all these different switches. Your environment, your food, your lifestyle is regulating all of these different switches that are turning on and turning off specific genes that hopefully have your best interests in mind. But what if they don't? Like, I just looked at some this week, some genetic testing this week, and I mean, people have 20, 30 different genetic polymorphisms, which are changes in the genetic code that are not ultimately helpful for them. And you got to have a way of synthesizing that information and promoting better function for them. How do we do that? It's through this epigenetic process. So anyway, it's kind of fun. But the problem with it, as I said, is that if you talk about genetics with your patient and you just talk about what the problems are, and you don't tell them the solution, or you don't tell them the way around it, if you're not educating your patient population on the gene expression portion of it, you are creating problems almost from the outset, just from an understanding perspective, and then also from a responsibility perspective. That's what I find, I guess I should say, in a more succinct fashion, is responsibility. Patient responsibility for their health outcomes goes down, in my opinion, when you bust out genetic testing without framing it appropriately for them. So that's key, very much so. Now, the genetic testing that I typically use, like, you can do specific genetic testing through Quest Diagnostics or LabCorp, that type of stuff, but really what it is when you do that is you're throwing a dart at a dartboard hoping to hit the bullseye, so to speak. And what I find is more helpful is doing more of an array of genetic testing. And the easiest way that I've found so far is specifically, just from an analysis perspective, is to use good old-fashioned 23andMe. 23andMe.com. I think it's like $200. Plus, you can figure out if you're Polish or whatever, right? But it's 23andMe.com. It's $200. And we're going to get an array of information out of this. Now, 23andMe.com, they don't actually publish and produce for you the health portion of the genetic profile that is going to be helpful for you and your patient. They're not going to do that. I think it's like a risk situation, risk management that they're trying to curb. But what you can do is you can download the 23andMe file, and you can, it's called a raw data file. You can download the raw data. You take that raw data and you could submit it to a third party. And the third party that I recommend utilizing is called Strategene. 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 Strategene is basically an analysis tool that was set up by a doctor named Dr. Ben Lynch. And it's got a really nice way of reporting information that you as a provider can take, and you can go through the metabolic map with it, or the DNA map, and look at different levels of metabolism, enzymatic activity, gene expression, etc. And it's a way that you can sit down and problem solve with your patients under the right circumstances, right? So this is super important, by the way, because when you look at explaining all of this stuff to your patients, you got to have all of your information backed up. If you don't have your information backed up, you're going to be out on a limb further than you want to be as a functional medicine provider or a nutritionist. And so this is going to be important. Okay, so Strategene does a really good job. They have everything cross-checked, front, back, sideways, up, down, all over the place. It's all documented for them as well, and they have a pretty awesome research history. So Stratagene does a very good job at this. So you would go 23andme.com, get the $200 report. They send you their version of the report, which is nice and fluffy and great and whatever. But then you can take the raw data file, submit it to Stratagene. I think it's like $40, $45, and they'll give you a full printout of what you want to find out with your patients. And what's cool is that they put it on biochemical pathways for you, and they'll tell you which genes are not doing their jobs, which enzymes rather are not doing their jobs because of the genetic expression. And you can basically find things out about your patients that that you wouldn't have otherwise. So do I do this on every single person? Absolutely not. No, I don't. And but I will talk about a case here that has proven to be very useful on, and so maybe going down the rabbit hole a little further than you wanted, doctor, but when we talk about genetic testing, there are applications that are phenomenal. Okay, so let's just talk about this. We see organic acid testing we talked about previously, and on an organic acid test we looked at something called quinolinic acid, where basically instead of tryptophan being funneled towards serotonin production, what happens is tryptophan gets funneled towards an excitotoxin, and really a neurotoxin called quinolinic acid. This quinolinic acid builds up and it creates an irritation and agitation in the patient, and we start to see the reactions of this, like short trigger, irritable, just about like weird stuff, right? Things that shouldn't irritate people, or the guy that's always upset about traffic. Like if you live in traffic and you're always upset about traffic, there might be a problem, right? Otherwise move. Right? Anyway, so what happens is we get this buildup of this excitotoxin called quinolinic acid. And in the functional medicine realm, one of the things that you can do is we can look at this genetically, and we can figure out, is this actually like from an infection, which would be more of an organic acid style of assessment, right? Let's say the infections come back and they're clean, but we still have this quinolinic acid that's like large and in charge. No infections. White blood cells are normal. The differential is normal in blood chemistry. Organic acid testing looks clean. Your stool samples look clean. But yet we still have this large amount of quinolinic acid buildup. Well, there can be a genetic situation where we have basically a funneling of tryptophan to quinolinic acid instead of tryptophan into like 5-HTP and then serotonin, etc. Well, if that's the case for your patient and we can't find this information on a blood chem or OAT test, this is, and essentially this is why it led me to this with this patient case. We'll look at it in a genetic profile. So we did the 23andMe, sent it to Stratagene, and it's just like a cotton swab in the mouth, by the way. Send it to Stratagene, the results, when they come back, and then Stratagene produces this report. And it turns out that when we talk about nitric oxide synthase, so a lot of different terms on the table here today, okay, but I'll tie them all together in a minute. Nitric oxide synthase, remember we have three different areas of that. We have iNOS, eNOS, and nNOS. eNOS, endothelial nitric oxide synthase, or this endothelial version of it, is responsible or absolutely necessary. It's a coupled reaction in the enzyme that turns tryptophan into 5-HTP. 5-HTP gets funneled into serotonin, serotonin into melatonin, patient sleeps, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is where we're headed here. But it all goes back to this this eNOS reaction that we have here. Okay, so with eNOS, if we have a genetic polymorphism in the gene that is producing this enzyme, eNOS, this nitric oxide synthase, what's going to happen is we're going to have a decreased or changed expression in this genetic profile. Well, that kind of stinks, because if your patient is doing everything right, but they still have terrible function when it comes to eNOS, or this NOS3 is what it's called, nitric oxide synthase, or an endothelial response. If they have this genetic polymorphism that decreases their ability to produce an appropriate response in this pathway, where they're taking tryptophan and producing melatonin so they can sleep at night, or tryptophan and producing serotonin so they can just be like, normal neurologic response, what's happening then is that genetically speaking, there's a roadblock in the traffic pattern. And just like I live in Minneapolis here, and so if we have a roadblock in Minneapolis on 35W, an interstate, what happens? The rest of the system gets backed up because, let's say, it's 50% decreased traffic flow. Well, you're going to have the rest of the system backing up. That's what I'm talking about. This is where genetic testing becomes useful. Like for this patient who was irritable, can't sleep at night, they're on 4 different sleeping medications, not helpful. SSRIs, not helpful, right, for depression. And we looked at the blood chemistry, we looked at the organic acid testing, and everything comes back clean except we see this high level of quinolinic acid. I said, all right, well, there's got to be an answer, so this is where the genetic test comes into play. And it turns out they have decreased expression of the gene that codes for this enzyme, the enos enzyme. All right, well, this is really cool because it doesn't mean that, hey, they're screwed in the long run. Okay, pardon my French. It doesn't mean that they're in trouble in the long run. It just means that, hey, we need to find a way around this roadblock. There's got to be a detour here somewhere. And the gene isn't shut off completely. Okay, so one of the things that's cool with Stratagene reports is that it actually will tell you, essentially, you have 40% decreased production or activity in this enzyme. Well, in this instance, this patient has decreased enzyme activity, and it's affecting their quality of life. Okay, because otherwise I don't really care about the gene if it's not affecting their quality of life, because they're not going to care about it, right? If they can sleep and they're not depressed and everything's like the world's great, they're not going to want to know that they have an enos defect. Okay, so in this instance, though, what we're able to do with this patient is be able to provide or support some of the cofactors that are present in order to improve function of it, right? So just like every enzyme, you have to have a cofactor for it. Okay, so let's say like the president can't do his job without the vice president, right? He ain't gonna do it. So for me, I'm married, and I'm not gonna do my job around my house without my spouse, right? I'm not gonna try to raise my kids by myself. I gotta have my spouse with me to do that. And so every enzyme has to have a cofactor. So I'm her cofactor, or she's my cofactor, however what you want to look at it. But the point is that you can support proper enzymatic function, or at least increase enzymatic function, by supplying higher levels of the cofactor. So with enos, what's interesting is calcium is a cofactor. And so this patient, chronically low on calcium, we see that in the blood chemistry. Okay. So that would be an important step in it. There's also things that you can find that are going to increase function or decrease function of this enzyme expression. And one of them with enos is estrogen. And guess what this lady just got done going through? Menopause. And so with all of that in mind, we see all of these things that are contributing factors. And so I'm not going to recommend that she goes and gets estrogen replacement therapy, but it does at least give me some ideas on how to stimulate or promote better function out of this enzyme that's being expressed poorly by this gene. Okay, so and remember, all of this is to get the patient to have a longer trigger, right? So they're not so irritable, to be able to sleep at night, so they can have quality of life, and then obviously, so they don't have to take these medications that are destroying their physiology. When we talk about SSRIs and sleeping medications, like you shouldn't have to take enough sleeping medication to put a horse down just to be able to go to bed on a random Tuesday. Okay, so super important. Now, with that in mind, there's just a way where you can work around it. So remember, genetic testing is not the end-all be-all. The genetic testing is not an etched-in-stone situation. It's just more information that can be helpful and relatively inexpensive. $245 is what we spent on this, or $240, and got information that we would have never gotten otherwise. Okay, so anyway, very cool. So what happens with the patient? When you support with more cofactor, you see which enzyme is not doing its job, and you learn how to augment or support proper function of that enzyme or increase function, patient gets better. Their quality of life improves, and that's really what it's all about, right? It's really what it's all about. So this patient, again, pretty intense situation that they were dealing with, but I've been treating this patient for well over 6 months. Okay, I think it's 6 and some change. And this patient, they're feeling better, beginning to feel better here with more and more information. And so we're only able to get 60 to 70% down the road with the blood chemistry and the organic acid testing, etc. There's just something missing. And instead of just running random tests, trying to figure out what it was, just went for the genetic code here. And sure enough, there it is. So I had enough information. Had checked under enough other things, right? Pick everything up and you look under it. We have looked at all of this stuff. And when it came up with 70% improvement, well, what about the other 30? Okay? So maybe that's me. Maybe it's to my own detriment sometimes, but more information is always better when you're willing to synthesize it. Okay? If you get handicapped by more information, then this is not for you. So, all right. So again, if you're at 70% and you're not satisfied with it, maybe look into the genetic testing with your patient doctor, okay? So they don't call me Dr. Hope for nothing, all right? So, all right. Let's see. Kind of random questions here today, but here's another one. Gastroparesis. Doctor, I have a patient who's recently diagnosed with gastroparesis, and they were told that they cannot follow a paleo-style diet. Okay. Interesting. And they also were told that they have to take these medications. Okay. So essentially, and the patient has type 2 diabetes and thyroid disease. All right. So essentially what happens with gastroparesis is the brain stops sending signals to the gut, and the gut stops transmitting signals back to the brain through the vagus nerve. And so we have just no communication between the two parts of the brain, so the enteric nervous system and your central nervous system. So in that type of a situation with gastroparesis, the patient is not going to go to the bathroom appropriately. It's just sitting in there. So they can go to the bathroom maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks sometimes. They have to give themselves daily enemas. Sometimes it happens with little kids. But the point is that something needs to change. And so I've seen this a few times over the years, and I'm going to give you a clinical pearl today that it was a hard-won lesson. I'll just say that. So I'll give you a clinical pearl that will make, man, if you didn't get anything out of the genetic testing, if you didn't get anything out of that, this is worth listening to the podcast just for this today. So this is a clinical pearl coming up in like 90 seconds. All right. So with gastroparesis, if the patient's bowels are not moving, okay, and they have diabetes, okay, there's a connection here. I want you to see this, doctor. The connection can be GABA. The connection can be GABA. So remember, a lot of the GABA is made in your belly. And we talked about this maybe a couple of weeks ago in the small intestine. And bacterial-producing cells are going to essentially produce GABA for you. One of the bacteria agents that you can use in order to produce or promote better GABA by farming it is Lactobacillus rhamnosus. GABA, as everybody knows, is an inhibitory chemical. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, right? And that's like, everybody understands that and they know that it's inhibitory, it's inhibitory, it's inhibitory. It decreases function of the nervous system, will settle everything down. Except in the enteric nervous system. Okay? It's actually excitatory in the enteric nervous system. Right? So how confusing is that? But now you see why this was a hard-won lesson, because how many times did I have to go through a gastroparesis situation before, with a patient, not personally, thankfully, but with a patient before we learned this. Oh my goodness. All right. So GABA is inhibitory in the central nervous system, which if you think about it, I mean, that's cool. And it's also inhibitory in the sympathetic nervous system. In the parasympathetic nervous system, which a lot of your enteric nerve tissue is going to be associated with the parasympathetic nervous system, this is going to be very important here. It's excitatory. GABA is excitatory, so it causes increased activity out of the nervous system associated with the gut. Well, if you got gastroparesis and your gut isn't moving, right, to the point where somebody's going to have to shove a tube up your rear end and give you colonics just to clean you out, you got to start looking for something that increases function. Now, a lot of these patients are going to be taking down prunes. They're going to eat fats like avocados and all this stuff. The problem is there's so much fiber in prune, in an avocado. They've gone through the Metamucil. They're eating like the Metamucil bars and the stuff. What they're doing is they're packing more sawdust into a colon that's not moving, so they're retaining more water in their colon, right? They're soaking up more water. The stool's getting harder and harder, and it creates this plug. Except the plug is not like a drain plug. The plug is like a rope plug. That's going to be an issue, okay? So in the long run, what I have found to be useful, and you got to take your own clinical judgment into this, right, is let them go get a colonic. Get everything cleaned out. Start re-inoculating with Lactobacillus rhamnosus. Use GABA for crying out loud. And in this instance, I probably wouldn't use liposomal GABA, right? What I would do is use something that's in a capsule that actually gets broken down and digested in the small intestine. And you got most of it that's activated in the small intestine there, activating the nutrients that are, activating the cells that are in the small intestine and the colon, really, at the site that you want them to be active. Okay, so GABA in the liposome is awesome when we're talking about central nervous system issues and that type of thing. Okay, but when we're talking about, hey, my intestinal cells just need more GABA, well, just put a GABA bomb in there and see how they do. Okay, so like a GABA 500 or something like that, they are phenomenal for this type of a situation. So again, this is gastroparesis. Does this handle any of the underlying mechanisms that caused it in the first place? No. This is just getting you out of the weeds here first, okay? So those are second and third ways that you would look at it. So I've found colonic to be helpful. And then you start re-inoculating with the Lactobacillus rhamnosus. Then you can use GABA. And their bowels should start functioning appropriately again. And then pick a fiber source instead of using fiber from 19 different places, and people aren't keeping track how much fiber they have. And so what happens is they're like taking in 45 grams of fiber a day, and they're wondering why they're backed up. Okay, so like avocados are loaded with fiber, and it's just something to think about. Okay, so prunes got lots of fiber in these things. So with that in mind, what's the issue in the first place? Decreased transmission on the vagus nerve, so we have decreased vagal nerve stimulation. So we start looking at brainstem issues with people. We start looking at inflammation, chronic inflammation that shuts down that information transportation highway between gut and brain. And so this is where things like an appropriate lifestyle of food come into play, big time. This is where we talk about like omega-3 fish oils and that type of thing as far as promoting better function out of the 3s and 9s. Helpful. So one of the things that I've found that actually can cause this problem is omega-6s, just because of the inflammation that's created with them. So if you have a patient that's like gastroparesis, I take a shake every morning. I make my own shake, and what do they put in it? All right, they're going to tell you, I put in flaxseed and flax oil, and all right, maybe chill on the omega-6s for a little bit, because what if you have a genetic issue that doesn't allow you to process them effectively? All right, how do you find that out? Just the tests I told you about previously. So anyway, the point is that they're just ask enough questions that we can get to the root of this. So that clinical pro, when we talk about gastroparesis, doctor, that I'm not even kidding. I think that probably took me 3 or 4 years, and I don't know how many cases to come up with that. But now when you see it, you handle it, and it's like, boom, all right, now what do you want to do? Okay, you want to keep putting fires out, or do you want to get to the root cause of this patient? Okay, and so sometimes they just want to keep putting the fires out, and that's fine. That's their thing. But every now and then you're going to get somebody that's like, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to keep having these fires. And so that's where you help with overhaul of the lifestyle. All right, what else we got going on here today? Another question, doctor. Folic acid. What's your stance on folic acid, doctor? It depends. That's my stance on folic acid. So this one's coming from a doctor in Florida. All right. Doctor in Florida, you know who you are. Thank you for listening, by the way. Folic acid. The more and more I read about it, the more and more that I would just avoid folic acid if you can. Unfortunately, it's in a ton of food that is being fortified by manufacturers, because it's I don't know if it's a mandate by the government right now, but it's strongly suggested. And I could probably find that out for you, though. Actually, you could probably find that out too, Dr. Google. So anyway, folic acid, what I've been finding more and more is people that don't have the ability to break it down, and it starts coming up with weird symptoms. Now, the government and all of the research that I've read surrounding this with folic acid, the research always comes back and they say it's inconclusive, it's inconclusive. And one of the reasons why I think that, and maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist a little bit, but there's a lot of money in fortification of food right now, and I don't think it's going to be changing anytime soon. And then secondly, when we talk about neural tube defects and fortifying food with folic acid, one of the reasons that people are doing that is because they want to make sure that your babies aren't born with, or stillborn, with neural tube defects. So the government, you kind of feel like a hero in that situation, and so I understand that. But one of the things that happens is that over time when people can't process folic acid, is it could be a genetic issue like MTHFR, that's cool. It could be one of those issues. But what happens is people end up with weird symptoms, like neurologic symptoms that are unexplained. And then what do you do in medicine with neurologic symptoms that are unexplained? You give a medication that covers up the symptom, or at least tries to mitigate it. And is it wrong? I don't know if it's wrong, but it's not efficient necessarily, right? So just something to think about there. So with folic acid, I would say that typically I tell my patients to avoid it if they can. Just get their folate, right, which is different than folic acid. Get their folate from their green leafy vegetables, which in Minnesota in the winter time, or the fall time as it is here right now, not a lot of people eating green leafy vegetables. And if they are, they're all coming in bags from California, right? And they're being frozen or whatnot. Now they're in the grocery store thawing on the shelf. And the point is that it's just some of the nutritional density, the nutrient density is decreased. So just something to keep in mind as you're talking about this with your patients if they ask you about folic acid. So folic acid, probably avoid, right? Just as a rule of thumb right now. And you're not going to avoid it completely because people are going to get it in the food they're eating, even if they eat at a restaurant. Okay? Well, I don't eat processed food. Well, if you eat out at a restaurant, you're going to get it. So, all right, important there. Some of the side effects in folic acid processing, like metabolism that happen, are rotten for people. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit here. But what happens is we end up with... this is actually cool too. This kind of ties in with the Strategene thing, but you can test this, submit it to Strategene. They'll give you the folic acid pathway breakdown, and you'll see which enzymatic activities are not happening appropriately. But essentially what can happen is people can end up with a lot of different neurologic symptoms that are unrelated to disease, but definitely mimic disease, right? So sometimes like tremors or twitching, or like a Tourette's-like situation. Not like a verbal or like oral Tourette's where people are like cursing, but like a twitch every now and then. That type of a thing. And what's interesting is that it's not because, folic acid is necessarily bad. It's just the volume they're getting for what their system can handle, right? Like the volume of traffic they're getting for what their, road system can handle is too much. And so you can decrease that. Symptoms tend to dissipate at that point. It's kind of fun. You don't have to test it genetically to find that out. You can, right? But it's just look at decreasing the volume of it there. All right. So hopefully that's helpful, doctor. I would imagine if you asked the question, you've had some experience with the folic acid situation. And so you probably have your own opinions around that. And so anyway, hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit better idea of where I come from with it. All right. I think we have time for one more question here. All right. Let's see. We got 5, 6, 7 of them here to choose from. Here's a good question. Doctor. Let's put it this way. All right. Here's a good question. Doctor. This gentleman basically says that he did a ton of research and utilizing hemoglobin A1C, which I appreciate. And I already responded to this doctor, by the way, in an email. But I'm going to respond to you guys as well because I want you to know this. So here's the point. How do we arrive at an A1C suggestion of 5.3? And so this doctor has very expansive and extensive experience in the research and just basically compiling data and looking at data seeing trends. And so he has way more experience at this than I do when it comes to analyzing research trends on a large population. Okay. So how do we arrive at 5.3 as our landing spot? And I will say this. Biogenetics as a whole, when we're doing research for biogenetics or teaching for biogenetics, the rule that biogenetics holds is that laboratory analysis utilizes optimal reference ranges based off statistical analysis. And in that instance, the statistical analysis is ultimately going to change with time as the population changes. So those laboratory ranges will change. And so right now, what we're comfortable with is 5.3 based off based off of the compiling of the literature. Got to get this gene situation out of my head from our conversation here. However, when that literature changes, I am way comfortable adjusting our A1C scores, whatever is optimal. Okay, so 4.5 right now to 6.4 that you're seeing on like a standard laboratory range is intense just because of what the medical literature says. There's a J curve where it says that below 5 people are sick, above 5.3 people are sick. And so with that type of a literature review, I'm comfortable with that right now. When more research comes out, right, if the research changes that suggestion, then we're going to change our suggestion. So I'm going to ebb and flow with the science of it. So hopefully that answers your response. No dogma, doctor. No dogma. Just an ebb and a flow as more literature becomes available. So very cool. One of the other things that's interesting when you talk about laboratory ranges, we talk about pathology range. You know that most laboratories that are producing, just written or wrote clinical data like this, where they're like, our lab range is 6.4 to 4.5. Okay, most of those people are not doing, they're not analyzing data in order to produce their own range, right? It's like a standard deviation. So you take all of this information, you put it on a bell curve, chop off 10% on either side, or basically a standard deviation either direction. And that's our lab range, right? So most of these labs are not producing their own ranges over and over. They're using data that's from decades past. Well, population is changing. How do we know that? Because the population's food supply is changing and the environment we live in is changing. So I feel like the data needs to change at some point. And like this doctor and I were talking about, science only knows what it's paid to know. Okay, and until somebody funds research that's going to develop new pathological laboratory ranges, we're stuck with ones from years past. So when you kind of peek behind the curtain of how the standard operating procedure is right now in the laboratory diagnostic world, kind of stinky. So anyway, so that's where the optimal ranges come from. Is instead of using 2 standard deviations, we're going to use 1 standard deviation, and then secondly, as much clinical data as we can get that's going to tell us about overall mortality rates, which I think are the most important part. So not to get super boring here with all the technical data in that, but the point is that you got to be open to the research dictating the laboratory ranges that you use. So all right, very cool, guys. Thank you for participating today with the Nutrition Hero podcast. Hopefully the clinical pearls that you heard, hopefully you put them to use. So I know there's going to be a few of you that we talk about gastroparesis. There's going to be somebody that walks into your clinic that says, I was diagnosed with gastroparesis, or I've been constipated for 17 days. Okay? Well, remember what we said. Bust it out, see how you do. Also, when you talk about genetic testing, don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of it. There's this thing, I don't know if it's a stigma with chiropractors or what, that they're like, genetic testing is not for me, right? Like, it's not in my area of expertise. It doesn't need to be in your area of expertise. That's what being an explorer is all about, okay? So be your nutrition hero, dig deep, and just keep looking. Don't stop learning, and this is a really cool way where you can do that. So, all right, as always, if you guys have questions, just send an email to Brad, B-R-A-D, at biogenetics.com, Brad at biogenetics.com, and we'll go through with that process coming up. I have a couple of good interviews coming up in the next few weeks here with some movers and shakers in the functional medicine industry. And I won't spill the beans on who they are yet, but you're going to want to tune in. So you've heard these people on podcasts, you've heard these people at lectures, and so it's going to be awesome. So, all right. If there's a topic you would like to hear more about, you could also email that to me, brad@biogenetics.com. I'm an open book, people. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bless you. We'll catch you next time.